So I just wanted to kind of throw back to you a couple of reflections from what I've heard and also from the experience of our Inclusive Cities programme. I would say that you are all far more expert on the Greek context than I am, so these are reflections and learning from the work that we do in the UK, the US and in Europe, and I would say, you know, take what you need and leave what you don't, in terms of there will be some things that don't necessarily apply to the Greek context, but hopefully are of some use and some interest. I wanted to focus on the title of the whole event, and particularly on the word reframing. We've heard quite a lot about the different debates that are happening on this area, the different levels of competence and the way that we frame these issues. And so there were 5 different areas that I wanted to very briefly touch on that are ideas about how this debate can be reframed, learning that we've had from the experience of working with municipalities in the UK, in the rest of Europe and the US, and we'll talk in more detail about them on Saturday, so I'm not going to give the examples that I was planning to give. So the first is this question about competencies, which came up in one of the comments right at the end, this idea that that migration is the competency of national government, integration is the competency of local government, and it's really important exactly which level we're talking about. But a way to reframe that is not to think about the competence, but it's to think about the different aims of the different levels of government, and to say that it's not necessarily that what's important is where the competence lies, but what's important is what each level of government is trying to do. So necessarily the level of government that controls migration policy is going to have a more exclusionary or inclusionary spectrum. That's the point of defining a migration policy. The point of local government, by its very nature, is the group of people who choose to live in a certain place or who are living in a certain place at a certain time. That is a different role, it has different aims and objectives. And one way I think that municipalities can reframe their way of engaging on this topic is not simply to say we disagree with what's happening at national government or we agree, but we have different goals and aims and we're trying to achieve different things, and that's okay. The second point that I wanted to make was about framing what the role of a municipality actually is, and this again draws a lot on the previous discussion. Quite a lot of the analysis that's been done of mayoral officers for immigrant affairs in the US has identified 3 main roles for municipalities, and they've all been touched upon. So the first is around leadership, both political and in terms of service provision. The second is the convening role in terms of bringing together partners and stakeholders. And the third is about the way that integration could be mainstreamed within the service delivery. One of the things that we know is that the public really cares about integration. That comes through a lot in the research, the segmentation research that's been done on what the public thinks about migration. And the Social Change Initiative, actually with More in Common, just published segmentation research for public opinion on migration in Greece, I think yesterday. But integration has a very low salience within local government, and some of the debates that we've heard, I think, have really seen that coming out. So why is that? And I think the point from the Vice Mayor, from Larissa, was very strong, which is political choices are being made and there is a prioritisation that is taking place. And the question is, why is that happening, and why is this not seen as a political priority, even though we know it's something that the public, particularly in cities, really cares about? And I think a good part of that is because of the way that we frame the question of migration, the way that we frame the question of integration. I think that's very pertinent to the Greek context, in the sense that almost everything that I've heard today has been about refugee integration. One of the frames that we use in the Inclusive Cities programme is a newcomer frame. So it's about saying, actually, the frame of choosing who you work with based on their migration status is a national frame. It's the frame of the competency of migration, rather than the frame of the competency of integration policy. So who are you choosing, how are you choosing who are you working with, and what you kind of think of as important. Also, the things that have come through, so we heard from DG Home, integration is a two-way process, that's a shared responsibility, but how many times do we actually see integration initiatives that truly are two-way and aren't just targeted initiatives that place all of the burden on the group, the newly arrived group? And actually, I think in the last session we did hear some examples again from Larissa of initiatives that have attempted to broaden out that definition, but all too often it remains very narrow. The second is an inclusive growth perspective. Again, this is about if you broaden out the definition beyond one particular migrant group, then you can start to look at the assets that are brought by groups. You can start to think about integration as part of a broader inclusive growth and economic development strategy. And on Saturday, I'll hopefully talk a little bit more about some cities that have done that, in particular Glasgow and Pittsburgh, but there are other examples as well. And finally, a place-shaping frame where we think about how actually the role of a municipality is to tell the local story of that place and to own the narrative of that place. And the principle of interculturality, which I'm sure we'll hear more about from Helena, is about saying, actually, this is about building a new whole and telling a new story for our community. And some of the work that we've been doing has been with Liverpool, who I'm not just mentioning because of the football. They've been working on the Our Liverpool programme, which is thinking about how they tell a new story, build a narrative of inclusion. And so that's about the municipality, but also in their convening role, bringing together unusual partnerships with their arts organisations, with sports organisations, with museums and heritage, to look at their...
Slow down.
I'm aware that we don't have time. About how they are able to build new narratives of inclusion. Last 2 points. We haven't talked that much about advocacy, but I've heard a couple of sort of pointed complaints about the lack of advocacy from the membership organisations for local government. I would say that because of the low salience of integration, we find that I found that in most of the countries that we've worked, is that the local government membership organisations are not particularly strong on these issues and don't particularly want to take a lead. But once groups of cities and municipalities have worked together, then they are able to make a stronger case based on the things that they have been able to do at the local level. And also then your asks on migration policy come from what would migration policy need to do to promote integration, rather than here are the things that we don't like about the current migration policy. And finally, one of the things that we've been trying to do, and again I'm sure will come out more with the Intercultural Cities programme, is also about networked capacity building. The question about how you bring smaller municipalities on board and how you build that capacity. And we've been using models developed through Eurocities and our own knowledge exchange programme, so using universities to try to support those municipalities that don't have the capacity to be able to develop their action plans and possibilities around integration. So a lot more to say, but that's a whistle-stop tour through some of the work that we've been doing.